The war for Israel's existence has raged for 7 decades, but in 2020, the Trump administration made a surprising breakthrough.
We're here this afternoon to change the course of history. After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East.
We went to Israel to ask, will the Abraham Accords bring peace to the region?
The Abraham Accords is the way of the future. We've seen barriers broken down, we've seen partnerships grow.
Or will they kick a hornet's nest?
You have boldly confronted the tyrants of Tehran.
There's a clock in the square in Tehran counting down to the end of Israel.
I urge the nations of the Middle East to set aside their differences, unite against the common enemy of civilization.
To all of Israel's friends in the Middle East, I say, Assalamu alaikum, peace unto thee, shalom.
Since its ratification by the UN in 1948, many of the states surrounding Israel have refused to recognize it. Tribal and religious loyalties run thicker than blood in the Middle East, and warring factions often have little time for international law, while legal states, which do exist, such as Iran and Qatar, provide heavy support for terrorist organizations which wage constant war on Israel.
Qatar is the main financier of the so-called Axis of Terror. Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, and on and on and on. And this is where the money for energy for the West is going.
Now, after years of diplomatic standoff, the Trump administration made a surprising breakthrough.
Something which nobody thought was possible, certainly not in this day and age.
The Abraham Accords refer to a series of peace and normalization agreements signed first between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and then the Kingdom of Bahrain in September of 2020.
The accords heralded diplomatic ties, economic cooperation, and shared defense programs between 3 of the region's most prosperous states.
This day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace.
So what caused this sudden diplomatic breakthrough? The obvious answer to this question is that as the region became stable and prosperous, it is in their best interests to maintain friendly relations with neighbors.
The United Arab Emirates is, I think, the most forward-thinking country in the Middle East, one of the most forward-thinking countries in the world, and Bahrain is an incredibly pragmatic and forward-thinking country as well.
The wealthier the Arab nations become, the greater the threat of Islamist extremism. Nearby Iran and Qatar not only refuse to recognize Israel, but fund terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Taliban, all of which are detrimental to the prosperity of the entire Middle East.
Iran, whilst is an existential threat to Israel, it is also a direct security threat to nations of the Gulf. And they know that and they understand that.
Dozens of Iranian lawmakers chanted "Death to America" as they met in parliament.
And whilst they still might have to say certain things in public, behind the scenes, they are thankful. They are thankful to Israel for leading this effort against the Iranian regime.
همین شرارت، همین دخالت، همین خباثت، همین رذالت رو در اعمال خودش داره، این مرگ بر آمریکا از دهان ملت ایران نخواهد افتاد.
But there was another element to Trump's diplomacy which goes right to the core of what the war on Israel is all about. In 2017, Donald J. Trump made a move of huge cultural significance. He recognized Jerusalem, the ancient spiritual heart of Israel, as the true capital.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
And this was acknowledged actually by the Muslim world, certainly by the Christian world, until very recent times. It was well understood that this was the spot of the Jewish temple.
Jews, Christians, and Muslims all stem from one patriarch, Abraham. And by placing the ancient cultures and holy sites at the center of his historic effort to bring the Abrahamic family of nations together, Trump's gesture says, I understand this matters to you, it matters to us too.
The Abraham Accords also opened the door for Muslims around the world to visit the historic sites in Israel and to peacefully pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam. The people of the Middle East will no longer allow hatred of Israel to be fomented as an excuse for radicalism or extremism. So important.
President Joe Biden was also positive about the Accords, but he preferred not to mention the name Abraham, calling them instead the normalization process.
There are people throughout our government who are focused on this process of normalization,
And
something
then-
that we very much support.
Okay, and then just as an aside, what does this? What do you call these agreements between?
They're normalization agreements.
Yeah, but what is the name for them?
Normalization agreements.
No, there's a specific name that they all signed on to. I believe you know what it is.
Look, we call them normalization agreements. That's precisely what they are.
Why do you not use the name that the leaders of these countries signed on to, which is the Abraham Accords? Why is that?
I'm not averse to using that. I'm describing what these are. These are
Well, then
normalization.
can you say it for me, please?
Of course, I can say the term Abraham Accords, Matt.
Thank you.
But we call them normalization agreements.
However, if international law is to work in the Middle East, it needs to take into account religious loyalties, because there is one country for which religious purity demands without compromise the complete destruction of any other faith.
There's a clock in the square in Tehran counting down to the end of Israel. What normative society has a clock counting down to the annihilation of another country?
The irony is that although the Iranian state is allied with fundamentalist terrorist organizations like Hamas and their state sponsors such as Qatar, Iranian society is educated and civilized. If it were not for the fanatical Islamic regime which has governed there since 1979, it would easily be wealthier than all its neighbors, and signing up for the Abraham Accords as well.
The Abraham Accords challenged the Islamic regime in Iran very deeply and the axis of evil forming alongside it.
I think that in the most abstract terms, the West is thinking along the lines that say, when there is evil, we need to find some accommodation with it. And we have lost the sense that when there is pure evil, like Nazism or like Hamas or like Iran, you need to vanquish evil. You need to defeat it. You need to win a war, not to reach a compromise with it and try to moderate it, because that is feeding the alligator. And that never turns out well. And Israel is in a situation where if we leave our blood in the water after what they did to us, all the other larger players around us will smell blood in the water. We can't afford this.
A united front against Iranian and Qatari-backed fanaticism is now forming all over the Middle East because, for all their differences, Muslims and Jews share at least two things in common: custodianship of the Abrahamic tradition and a desire for peace. When we hear about the wars and the political differences in the Middle East, we often forget that this is a family battle. Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all descendants of Abraham, and at the heart of Jerusalem is Temple Mount, where Abraham prepared to kill his son Isaac, as a sacrifice to God. At the last moment, God spoke to Abraham, telling him not to extinguish his line. 4,000 years later, there is still a feeling, on all sides, that to prevent the bloodshed of Abraham's children, we must respect sacred tradition, not just international law.
First, the Abraham Accord is a proof that peace in the Middle East is possible, and Israel proved it before, while we made peace with Jordan and Egypt that was huge enemies of Israel. And I think that the Abraham Accords proves to the Israelis and to the world that peace in the Middle East is possible and also desirable by people that actually want to live and not to fight and not to die.
We can only talk about more countries joining on, of course, including hopefully Saudi Arabia next, which would be, the complete paradigm shift in the Middle East.